So my name's Camille Privé, I'm a Regional Intelligence Analyst here at Intelligence Fusion, and today I'll be talking about economic sanctions, their effectiveness and the sanctions that have been applied to Russia. So economic sanctions are penalties applied against a country, an individual or a group. They are applied by a group of countries or multinational entities such as the EU or the UN. So they're primarily used to stop a certain behaviour or alter a certain behaviour from the group or the entity or the state that the sanctions are being imposed against. They are usually used in conditions to instill regime change or to prevent conflict or to stop a certain actor from engaging in certain policies, activities or behaviours. They are primarily used in situations where military intervention isn't an option or would be too expensive to use. They can also be used as a signalling tool, which then would prevent other countries from engaging in certain behaviours, as they would then receive the same penalties the original sanctioned country has received. It's really important to remember that with economic sanctions, they're only usually effective and they only really work if the cost of the sanction is much greater than the cost of continuing a certain behaviour for the sanctioned country. So sanctions are usually applied on a case-by-case basis, but they fit into 6 broad categories, which are embargoes. So an embargo is a broad trading ban with a country. So there's usually humanitarian exceptions for food and medical products so that the local populations don't suffer too much. Long-standing examples have included Cuba, Iran and North Korea. Then there are export controls which restrict the specific supply of products to the sanctioned countries. So this usually includes technologies and weapons. Then there are capital controls, which restrict the investment in a certain country or industry. Next, there are trade sanctions, which usually look at restricting imports that can be brought into a certain country. And then finally, there is asset seizures and freezes, as well as travel ban, which restricts certain listed individuals and or citizens potentially from entering a certain jurisdiction. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of benefits in terms of no military intervention, and they can be low cost and low impact for the sender of the sanctions if they're managed effectively. However, academics have said that sanctions tend to work about 40% of the time, so there is a lot of drawbacks to using sanctions. One of the main drawbacks is that sanctions can produce a lot of unintended consequences, both for the country that has sent the sanctions and for the country that is receiving the sanctions. Because of the nature of the interconnected global financial system, this means that by imposing economic sanctions on a country, the sender country can often receive their own economic drawbacks from this and suffer economically. Secondly, imposing sanctions can sometimes send the sanctioned country to look for different economic partnerships, which in the long term can hurt the sender country. One of the main criticisms of using economic sanctions is that they tend to hurt disproportionately the ordinary population and the local populations within sanctioned countries. So the US and other Western nations have tried to come up with what they call smart sanctions, which aim to maximise the impact on the economy that is being sanctioned while minimising the impact on ordinary citizens. But again, this has seemed to work a lot better in theory than in practice. And one of the final drawbacks that I'd like to talk about today is counter-sanctions. So if a country is well placed within the global economy, they are in a position which is they're free to impose sanctions of their own, which almost always have adverse economic impacts on the sender country. The Russian example is very interesting because it's been a country that's been sanctioned by many different nations, notably the EU, which I'm going to talk about now. But it's also had economic repercussions, as about 1,000 businesses have left or curtailed their operations in Russia since the start of the war. So the EU has set sanctions with 2 intended effects. The first effect is to limit Russia's ability to finance the war in Ukraine, and the second repercussion is to really impose clear political and economic repercussions on those responsible for financing the war. So the EU has made two notes in regard to their sanctions. Firstly, they have designed the sanctions to have minimal impact on EU businesses and EU citizens. However, this hasn't worked very well in practice, as many EU nations are currently experiencing cost of living crises. Secondly, the EU have tried to limit import and export restrictions that would restrict food and medical supplies as to not affect the Russian citizens too badly. The EU have mainly applied three different types of sanctions, so individual sanctions, trade-related sanctions, and financial sanctions. In terms of the individual sanctions, since 2014, the EU have sanctioned 1,212 individuals and 108 different entities. So these range from Putin himself to oligarchs to members of the Duma and the National Security Council, as well as high-ranking politicians and high-ranking military officials, as well as many more. So these individuals have seen their assets being frozen in terms of their bank accounts, as well as physical seizures of their assets, such as yachts and property being taken. So next, in terms of trade sanctions, the EU have limited imports as well as exports. In terms of exports, the EU have prohibited the following exports from being sent to Russia: cutting-edge technologies, as well as goods, technology and machinery related to the energy, maritime, aviatory and space-related industries. They have also prohibited the sale of dual-use goods, so goods that could be used both in a civilian and a military context, as well as luxury goods. In terms of imports that cannot be brought into the EU, these are mainly related to oil and solid fossil fuels, as well as coal products. So the oil restrictions have been set to be applied gradually for 6 months for crude oil and 8 months for refined petroleum products. There have been exceptions for members of the EU that would suffer too much from an immediate cutback from these. And so when the restrictions will come into effect, about 90% of the EU's oil supply from Russia will be subject to restrictions. In terms of the financial sanctions that have been applied, Russia has been prohibited from using the SWIFT system for their financial transactions. On top of this, the EU, as well as many other nations, have restricted the transactions with the National Central Bank of Russia, which means many of the foreign cash reserves that are stored abroad are now unavailable to Russia. It is estimated that about half of these foreign reserves are now frozen, which has severely decreased the budget that Putin now has available to him. So initially, Russia did seem to be able to weather the sanctions, but as time has gone on, the economy is certainly taking a big hit. Many people were concerned that Russia would turn to Asian markets to make up the losses that they were losing, especially in terms of fossil fuel sales. However, if we look at the sales of natural gas between Russia and China, for example, China only received last year 10% of what the EU received. Secondly, the gas pipelines connecting Russia and Europe are much better connected and can send a lot more. So in terms of this, they won't be able to make up their losses. In terms of oil, Russia has looked to other buyers. However, other buyers have many more purchase options and so have been driving down the price of oil for Russia. So it's unlikely that even if Russia are able to make up the amounts that they would sell to Europe, that they will be able to make the same money from it. So Russia is really going to struggle to make up that difference. In terms of businesses, the Russian economy has taken a great hit as well. Global businesses represented 12% of the Russian workforce, and the business activities represented about 40% of Russian GDP. So they will lose a lot of money from businesses having retreated from Russia. On top of this, about 500,000 members, highly skilled members and highly educated members, have left Russia since the start of the war. In terms of numbers, the Russian GDP is expected to fall by 7.8% officially, and unofficial reports place this number as high as 30%. Finally, in the first 100 days of the war, Putin is estimated to have spent $75 billion of his foreign reserves, and it's estimated that Putin only currently has access to about 380 million of those. EU sanctions have a major flaw because the EU currently relies on Russia for 40% of its gas consumption. This means that come winter, Russia is likely to threaten to turn the gas off, if not turn the gas off completely. And whilst EU are working to reduce their dependency completely on Russia by 2030, this isn't going to come in time for winter 2022. And unfortunately, the sanctions are likely to be tested, if not completely withdrawn, as EU populations are unlikely to stand up well to not having any heat or not being able to heat their houses. So in that respect, the sanctions can be viewed as tokenistic, as in the short term they are hurting the Russian economy, but in the long term, as they're likely to be revised, they may not have the intended impact. So in general, I think it's really important to look at sanctions on a case-by-case basis, as whether or not they achieve their intended effect generally relies on multiple factors and not just the economic sanctions alone. I think sanctions can be an effective tool. However, they really need to be designed looking to mitigate the risks associated to sanctions. And I think effective sanctions are sanctions that stand up to being tested. I think democracies are prone to not being able to resist sanctions being tested, as their governments are much more accountable to their populations, and populations within democratic countries are more likely to not put up with bad socioeconomic conditions within their own countries. Thank you for watching that episode of The Insight. If you'd like to get involved in the discussion, join our OSINT community on Discord by following the link in the description below.